Hello and welcome to today's video. I'm Joanne and I create videos that help you sleep. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click that notification bell. Shortly after my announcement about starting a Patreon page, I received an email from one of my followers and it said, "Dear Joanne, I was as grieved as anyone upon hearing your latest announcement. But you also just laid a golden opportunity before me. This is an original story I had written back when I knew this boy. Though we were never together, we loved each other for many years. This story will walk you through the course of the romantic relationship between two protagonists. I hope your viewers will enjoy it as much as your other works. Lilah J Del'Addams." I will read the story while giving you a behind-the-scenes view of the narration in my studio. If you want to reach out to the writer of the story, you can find her email in the video description down below. If you have a story you've written and would like me to read it here on the channel, feel free to reach out to me anytime. What a wonderful thing it is to be able to share our creativity together in this way. So, my friends, let's get comfy together now, and I will read this lovely story that has been generously offered for your relaxation. I wish you all a peaceful night and a restful sleep. The Honeymoon Phase by Lilah J Del'Addams. Lucy awoke early one morning in her new bedroom, and she had the date, May 30th, marked on her calendar. This was the day where she would be inviting her parents to her new apartment in North Oshawa. She had also planned to surprise them by introducing them to her new boyfriend. Adam Zanette was one of Lucy's very first friends in her high school class. She still smiled as she sat and thought about all the times she and Adam would laugh together, tease each other, and try to outsmart each other on several occasions. Lucy was always a logical person and never spoke much to boys her own age when she first came to high school. When Lucy met Adam, he sat right in front of her in most of her classes. She was not impressed with him at first, looking at how notoriously flirty he was with many of the other girls. Adam, on the other hand, first noticed Lucy soon after the school year started. He loved her intelligent and excitable personality. He used to love teasing her, just as he did with many of the others. So Lucy decided to ignore him, hoping he would eventually tire himself out. But with each passing day, the more she ignored, the harder he pushed for her attention. Eventually, Adam called on all his friends to join him in tormenting poor Lucy. At last, she decided that she had finally had enough. One day, when she was walking to class, Adam came behind her and pulled her by the arm. She broke free from his grasp and cried, "Will you get away from me? What more must I do to get you to leave me alone?" To her surprise, he stepped away and never said a word to her for the rest of the day. The next day, Adam decided to try to talk to Lucy again, but this time he would ask her about her schoolwork, her family, and her political opinions. Each time he did, Lucy would give him a confused look, for it did not seem like he was making fun of her this time, and she cautiously answered all his questions. Somehow or another, the two of them eventually became friends. They would talk in between their classes for hours. Soon after they graduated from high school, Adam invited Lucy to join him for dinner. They began meeting up regularly soon after that, and they finally made their new relationship official only 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Devons, Lucy's mother, had heard Lucy talk about Adam, but she had never met him. Lucy's parents finally arrived to see her new apartment, and Lucy greeted them at the door. Mrs. Devons helped Lucy with the lunch table. "Is someone joining us, Lucy?" Mr. Devons asked. How come there are 3 extra places set?" But Lucy was determined not to tell them until the rest of the party had arrived. "Oh, you will see," Lucy said. "They should be here soon." This, however, only excited their curiosity. "Who are they, dear?" Mrs. Devons asked. But Lucy refused her answer once again. "Never mind, Mom," she said. "Would you mind finishing off the table while I go to my room to change?" Lucy pulled out a casual dark red dress with a white short-sleeved sweater. Once she had the dress on, she tied 2 short strands from the side of her head into braids and tied them together behind her head with a thick white thread. Suddenly she heard her mother calling to her. "Lucy," she cried, "there's someone here to see you." She rushed to the front door to see Adam in a white collared shirt with a bouquet of daisies in hand. Lucy welcomed her guests inside. She took Adam by the hand while he took off his shoes. While all the parents sat down and got acquainted, Lucy brought Adam into the kitchen. Lucy helped Adam roll up his white sleeves, and she pulled out a glass vase. She removed the plastic wrap around the flowers while he filled the vase with ice water. He took a large pair of scissors and cut the stems of the flowers, while Lucy added a teaspoon of sugar and vinegar to the vase. Lucy took a large wooden spoon and mixed the sugar and vinegar into the water. "The sugar feeds the flowers," Lucy explained to Adam, "and the vinegar helps to kill bacteria." With that, they added the flowers to the vase. Once they finished, they joined the rest of the party. Mr. and Mrs. Annette asked Lucy how she liked living in Oshawa. Lucy had just moved there for a new job. "Perhaps I could show you around sometime," she said. 2 weeks had passed since the lunch party, and Lucy had just come home from work. The phone rang just as she was taking off her shoes, and Adam answered when she picked up the phone. "I was hoping maybe we could go for a drive," he said. Lucy smiled and said, "I'll be ready at 5. She changed out of her work uniform into a light purple t-shirt and jeans, and she packed a basket of bread, fruit, and cheese for the 2 of them to share. Adam came up to Lucy's apartment, and she brought him into the kitchen. Adam was surprised to see that the flowers he brought that day he and his parents came were still standing perfectly tall. "They are still alive?" he asked. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind and said, "Of course they are still alive. You gave them to me." Adam then drove Lucy to a rocky shore down by Rouge Park. He helped her along the rocks towards a small wooden dock where they slipped off their shoes and dipped their feet in the water. They sat down, and Lucy pulled out the basket of food that she had packed. They spent hours down by the beach until it began to get a little chilly down by the water. So they pulled their feet out of the water, dried off, and Adam drove Lucy back to her apartment. "Would you like to come inside?" she asked. "We still have time." Adam parked his car by the main entrance and followed her inside. They slipped off her shoes and they went into her bedroom. Adam sat down on Lucy's bed and slowly lifted the blinds to her bedroom window. Meanwhile, Lucy lit a scented candle and placed it on her dresser. She joined Adam on the bed as the warm smell of vanilla filled the room. They watched the sunset outside her window. Lucy pulled out her sketch pad and began to draw the glittering view of the city just outside her window pane. Suddenly she jumped up and said, "Oh, I almost forgot." She went and opened one of her drawers and pulled out a small box. "You'll be turning 19 in 2 weeks. I got you something," she said. Adam opened the box to see a silver watch inside. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Thank you so much." He fastened the watch around his wrist and pulled Lucy closer to him. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he replied. She wrapped her hands around his neck and kissed him. They both laughed, and she pulled away, for they had both just realized that it was the first time they ever kissed. Adam wrapped his arms around Lucy's waist as they continued watching the sunset together. After a few hours, it had gotten much darker in Lucy's room, and she was slowly drifting off to sleep. Adam slowly laid her down on the bed and blew out the candle that Lucy had lit. He removed his sweater and draped it over the chair tucked in at her desk before he lay down on the bed next to her. The next morning, Lucy woke up to find Adam peacefully sleeping next to her. She brushed her hands through his short brown hair, and he slowly stirred awake. He glanced at his new watch and jumped up with a start. "Oh no, it's getting late. I must get ready for work," he cried. Lucy got up from the bed and helped him get his sweater and shoes back on. She followed him down the stairs, unaware that she was still in bare feet. She walked him to his car and kissed him goodbye before he drove away. Lucy went back inside and sat on her desk. She saw the picture in her sketch pad, which was not yet finished. She went to her drawer and pulled out a box of colored pencils. She sat by her window, and within a few short hours, the picture was finished. She tore the page from the book and she signed it, Lucy Ann Devens. She went to a small box in her closet where she pulled out a dark wooden frame, and she placed the framed picture next to the vase of daisies on her kitchen counter. Week after week, Adam would visit Lucy in her apartment. They would drive together, read together, and cook together, until one day, after 4 years, Adam came to see Lucy and told her that he had to cancel their evening together. His boss called him to go to a conference in Seattle for 4 weeks, and that he had to leave as soon as possible. "When will you be leaving?" she asked. "I plan to leave Thursday night," he replied. Lucy offered to drive him to the airport, but he politely refused and would not give any reasons as to why. So, with a heavy heart, she kissed him goodbye and watched as he drove away. 3 weeks had passed since Adam had gone, and poor Lucy waited anxiously for him to come home. She decided to call him late one night, but received no answer. 3 more nights she tried, again and again, but to no avail, and she was beginning to worry. The next day, she called Mr. and Mrs. Annette. "Have you heard from Adam since he left?" she asked. "He has not been answering any of my calls." Mrs. Annette said, "I called his employer and she said that they should be returning Friday morning. Why don't we go to the airport together and meet him there?" Lucy agreed. That night, when she was in bed, she could hardly sleep for joy. She couldn't wait to see Adam again and ask all about his trip. At the very break of dawn, she jumped up and quickly got herself dressed and walked to her car. She drove to pick up Mrs. Annette, and they drove to the airport together, and they waited by the front gate. The plane landed around 10 o'clock that day, but Adam was nowhere to be seen. Lucy looked at the flight schedule, and the next flight was to arrive in 4 hours. Mrs. Annette tried to reassure Lucy that he would soon come. "Why don't we grab something to eat while we wait?" she said. It had been hours since Lucy had eaten, so she agreed. When they returned to the gate, Lucy waited for Adam to get off the plane once again, but there was still no sign of him, and no other flight would be landing any time soon. Seeing Lucy distressed and weary, Mrs. Annette offered to drive Lucy home and that they would return tomorrow. With no other choice, Lucy agreed. So Mrs. Annette called her husband to let him know that they were leaving the airport, and they were off. When they reached Lucy's apartment, Mrs. Annette laid a reassuring hand on Lucy's and said, "I'm sure he's fine. I will try calling him tonight to see what happened." They walked up to Lucy's suite together. Lucy unlocked the door and walked inside. Lucy looked around her apartment, dimly lit by 8 flickering candles laid across the floor. Mrs. Annette followed her in and giggled. She saw her parents seated on the living room couch and Mr. Annette seated in a small chair beside them. Mrs. Annette joined her husband on a small stool next to him. Standing just in the middle of the room, further from where their parents were sitting, there was Adam, dressed in a white collared shirt and black dress pants. Without a word, Lucy ran and threw her arms around him. "Where have you been?" she cried. "I had tried to reach out to you for weeks, but there was no answer. I was so worried about you." He smiled and said, "I am so sorry it had to be this way, but I didn't really know how else to surprise you. I came back from my work conference 3 days ago, and I went to see your parents. I spoke to Mr. Devons, and he gave me permission." Lucy glanced over at her parents to see that Mrs. Devons had pulled out her video camera. That's when she knew something was afoot. Adam broke away from Lucy's embrace and said, "For almost 8 years we've known each other, and for almost 4 of those years we've been together. When we first met in school, I always knew you were sweet, intelligent, and beautiful, but I never would have guessed that our relationship would take us this far." He reached into his back pocket and continued, "I have wondered for a long time when it would be a good time to ask you, but I have finally decided." He placed a small box in her hand, and she opened it. Inside was a blue sapphire ring. Adam took her other hand in his. "Lucy Ann Devons, I love you so much," he said, "and it would mean so much to me if you would be my wife." Lucy was shocked by the sudden turn of events that she couldn't even respond. When she finally pushed herself to speak, she turned to her parents and she said, "Dad?" Mr. and Mrs. Devons looked at each other, a bit confused by her response. "Yes?" asked Mr. Devons. "Will you give me away?" asked Lucy. "I'm getting married." With that, she threw her arms around Adam and the parents cheered. Later that year, Adam and Lucy were married. They moved to a small house in Barrie where they welcomed a new baby daughter, Della. They lived there for many happy years since then.